Welcome, everyone. My name is Dalia Simangan, Associate Professor at Hiroshima University, and I'm glad that all of you are joining us today for this 37th NERPS, or the Network for Education and Research on Peace and Sustainability at Hiroshima University. This series actually started almost 5 years ago, back in 2020, and we're very happy that we have a series of speakers that have joined us in the past years. So today is an important topic. We'll be dealing with an important topic, but before that, I just want to welcome again our attendees. We'll have the presentation for about 30 minutes, and then you'll have the chance to ask questions later. I know this topic will incite a lot of reflections and also thoughts from you. So you'll have the chance to ask the questions later through the Q&A box. But you may also raise your virtual hand and we'll be able to unmute you. All right, so the topic for today's webinar is Making Peace with Nature, Contributions on Environmental Justice and Peace Building in Colombia, which is very suitable with the peace sustainability nexus that NERPS, our network, has been emphasizing for years. I think there's now this growing recognition that nature and non-human nature are very much entangled, but much of modern history really relegated nature as just, instruments to human development. And also in the context of armed conflicts, a lot of times non-human nature become, victims or degraded because of human activities. So this webinar, using the case of Colombia, this webinar will present an overview of how nature is now becoming recognized as a victim of war as well, alongside human societies. And we have two excellent speakers with us. I'm very excited to be moderating this webinar and also introducing our speakers. First, we have Professor Vanesa Giraldo, who is an assistant professor at Icesi University. She holds degrees in anthropology, public health, and most recently a PhD in anthropology from the University of Massachusetts. And joining Vanessa is Professor Inge Valencia, who is an associate professor, but also at Icesi University. She's an anthropologist who graduated from the National University of Colombia and holds also a PhD in anthropology at the School of Higher Studies in Social Sciences in Paris, France. Thank you so much, Inge and Vanessa, for joining us today. And now let's move on to your presentation.
Okay. Thank you, Dalia, and good morning for everyone. We are here in Colombia. It's 8 p.m. in the night, so good night also for if there is somebody in Colombia that is attending the conference. We're going to make this presentation about making peace with nature, contributions on environmental justice and peace building from Colombia. First of all, we want to thank the NERPS of Hiroshima University for this invitation. Also, maybe Professor Vladimir Lewinsky that is attending the conference because he make the link between us. And for the development of our talk, we will first make a brief contextualization of what has been the armed conflict in Colombia. Then we will talk about this relationship between nature and armed conflict. And then we will address finally the relationship between peace, nature, and environmental justice. So we're going to start with a little bit of context. It's important to remark that Colombia's armed conflict has been the direct result of a deeply rooted social and political conflict and have had different transformations over time. We have been here for almost 60 years ago, or more years. But also the interaction of political and economic and social factors, as well as the participation of different illegal armed actors have shaped its evolution and its consequences. For example, today we have the participation of different armed actors such as guerrillas, paramilitaries, and criminal groups, which have deeply victimized civil society. Here you have some data that shows the humanitarian impacts that Colombia has experienced. We have almost 10 million victims. That is the 19% of the population in Colombia. Almost 450,000 people killed, 60,000 disappeared, 40,000 people kidnapped, 5 million people displaced. So you see that data there. So this is a huge situation that reflects the humanitarian tragedy we are living. Also, it's important to remark that war and peace cohabit together in our history. There have been simultaneous conflicts and post-conflict situations in Colombia. We have almost 12 peace accords made since 1985. So we are a society that engaged peace despite all the prevalence of this violence. But actually, we have some differences that are marking this moment. First, it is important to say that actually Colombia has two major peace policies. We have the final peace agreement that was established with the FARC in 2016. That is the most internationally recognized agreement. But also in the last years, we have the Total Peace Law that was signed by the government of Gustavo Petro in 2022. And it is important to recognize that it means an institutionalization of the peace construction. But also, we are living in a context that is characterized by the slowdown of the implementation of the peace accords. This is a really bad situation, and we are living an escalation of violence. An example of this situation is how the violence against social leaders continues to grow. And since the signature of the peace accords in 2016, we have almost 1,700 social leaders that have been murdered. It is a tragedy that we are living in our country. Also, it is important to remark that the impact affects different over the ethnic groups, including indigenous and Afro-descendant populations. The war we have had have a significant impact on these populations and their territories, and these have produced ongoing exclusion, discrimination, and intense violence. And finally, it is important to remark also that due to territorial control over areas rich in biodiversity, mainly to access the illicit economies, there is a big control by the armed actors in some biodiversity regions. This situation show us a deep relationship between nature and armed conflict that has been closely linked to exploitation and appropriation of natural resources. Here in Colombia, the presence of illegal armed groups, the drug trafficking, and the development of legal and illegal extractive activities have had important environmental and cultural and social consequences in the country. Here, I think it's important to remark two things. First, the relationship between armed conflict and nature has been explored by authors such as Paul Collier or Hufler, who noted that the main reason for the emergence of long-lasting civil wars in scenarios where valuable natural resources were present is the profits left behind. This is true, but there is also an interest in doing some territorial control and regulate the social order over the populations. This situation has a big impact on community and social processes. The control over the populations can be seen, for example, as the situations we already described, when social leaders are being killed because they stand in the way of illegal armed actors that want to control territories and routes that are important for accessing illegal economies. When a community leader is murdered, an essential part of the culture and social relationships of the community are lost, which constitutes a direct attack against the cultural survival of its people. Second, it is very important to see that in regions rich in biodiversity, the exploitation of natural resources has become a means of financing war, exacerbating the dynamics of violence and deepening inequalities and social conflicts, as Dalia said at the beginning of the seminar. Nature has been used as a tool for power and territorial control, but also is a direct victim of the country. That is very important and central for us. Here, I want you to show some maps to make a deeper contextualization of the scenario we're living. So now Colombia has recently seen an expansion in the presence of our actors in biodiversity regions, like here in the Pacific regions in our country. And actually we have the highest historical data related to illicit economies. For example, this year, UNODC made this documentation about the illicit crops that you see here in the yellow color. We have actually 2,053 hectares of illicit crops, but also we have illegal gold mining, almost 100,000 illegal hectares that you see here in the lines, in the little gray lines, and also a very important situation about the deforestation that we're going to see in the next map. It is important to say that, for example, 49 of the illicit crops in Colombia are located in areas of high biodiversity value. And we see how this pattern is evident in biodiverse regions like the Pacific coast here, like the Catatumbo near the Venezuelan frontier, or the Amazonia, where our actors seek illegal rents. But also, it is important to see that this situation are affecting local populations and fortifying the militarization of biodiversity regions. That is very important because this is another situation that we are facing about the militarization of nature. Not only the victimization, but the militarization of it. Here, in these maps, we want to show the situation about the relation between the illegal economies, such as the coca crops, the illegal mining, the deforestation. And in the map you are seeing in the right side, it is the relation with the social leaders' assassinations. In the right, you are seeing the spatial variation in the occurrence of violence against social civic leaders. For example, we have municipalities like here, Tumaco, in the south of the country. I don't know where it's at. Here, or in northern Cauca, here in Antioquia, or Catatumbo, or here in Caquetá, where you see a relation between the illicit economies and the assassination of social leaders. And this happens because it is related because civic and social movement leaders are assumed to be a hindrance to the control of lucrative illicit markets like coca and gold mining. This is the case, for example, of leaders such as our Vice President, Francia Marquez, and another leader that was very near for her, that was, his name is Cesar Cerón, who was a major candidate, who have been treated for denounced illegal mining activities in Suarez, that is a municipality from the northern Cauca. There is a place very near from Cali, where we are living actually with Professor Vanesa. And this happened on 2020 before Francia was elected as vice president. But it is very important to show how the threaten and the assassination of social leaders has been linked to importance of illicit economies and the presence of criminal armed actors. And furthermore, these conditions are related to the limited capacity of the Colombian state to effectively penetrate all of its territory. Now, we want to share also how the consequences of this situation for regions rich in biodiversity are diverse and complex. Both the illicit crops, deforestation, or the illegal mining have had an important negative impact on the environment and the populations of these territories. For example, this is the Quito River. We did some field work on 2019 before the pandemic. And this river you see, that is the Quito River, has been heavily affected by illegal mining. Chocó is a department that makes part of the Pacific region, one of the most biodiverse in the world. These images were taken during the fieldwork, and we share also some activities with this photographer that is called Stephen Kagan, who really tried to show the environmental impacts of illegal mining and the impacts also that were leaving some communities in the Chocó department. This mining that you see in the images is characterized by the presence of vegetation-free areas, often buried under the extracted materials, and by the presence of deep ponds filled with water, with mechanical arms remove the land to release soil and water containing the mostly gold and platinum. But illegal mining has different impacts on both human and nature. It damages and erodes the rivers, affecting people's health. Remember, Colombia is the country with the highest mercury contamination in the Americas, and loses the topsoil for agriculture that destroys the lives of peoples and territories. So we already see this worrying situation between the armed conflict, the illicit economies. And what is clear is that we're seeing how the war and the socio-environmental dynamics in Colombia are closely linked, reflecting how the exploitation of natural resources has created profound social and environmental inequalities. Achieving peace in Colombia depends on more than just the end of the hostilities. It also depends on the possibility of the communities to participate in decision-making over their territories, as well as their ability to establish peaceful relations with nature, where we all are responsibility for it, for achieving long-term peace. That's the reason peace and reparation must have an intersectional and differential approach, where nature plays a determining role. So we want to continue showing that some efforts have been made. In the final peace agreement that was signed with the FARC, there are some ideas, some programs that shows how nature must be respected, how nature must be reparated. And we can see it by this proposal by the state, but also from the processes of territorial defense and peace building carried out by communities in their territories. And that's now the time for Professor Vanesa to show us how after war we can also look for peace building in our country.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much, Professor Valencia. Good evening for everyone who is joining from Colombia, and good morning for everyone joining from Japan. I think it's worth saying that April 9, the your day, it's such an important day here in Colombia. It's actually the Day of the Victims of the Armed Conflict. We commemorate on April 9th, every April 9th, we commemorate all the victims, all the people, and all the non-humans too that have suffered this endless war, and we raise our voices to build more peaceful tomorrow. So it's such an honor to be part of this webinar. Thank you very much for the kind invitation, and thank you to our colleague Vladimir. I also join Inge here for connecting academic world. So I'm going to talk about how the relationship between armed conflict, peace, and environment has been approached in Colombia through three different but quite compatible perspectives. Not saying those are the only ones, but it seems to be that they capture the intercultural conversation that the state has had with the very diverse communities that inhabit the also very diverse geographies of this country. So I will start with the idea of territorial peace, which was a central concept of the peace agreement. And it is both the peace agreement that Professor Valencia just mentioned, the one that was signed in 2016 between the Colombian government and the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia. And probably one of the most important peace agreements of our history. And it is this concept, the territorial peace concept, it is both theoretically and politically linked to the rethinking of rural spaces as territories that are socially constructed. And it has emerged in various countries in Latin America. Through processes that have brought visibility to rural sectors in the development of public policy. In Colombia, this concept has gained particular relevance in the post-agreement period. Initially, the idea of territorial peace was used to indicate that the peace dialogues would complement a human rights and social justice approach with a territorial approach, an approach that took into account the particularities of the different sites and communities that have been affected by the armed conflict. Given the vast diversity of realities shaped by the effects of war across different territories, negotiators acknowledged the need to mobilize and coordinate efforts that responded to these particularities. However, during the implementation of the peace agreement, and unfortunately, in the face of the many obstacles that the implementation of the agreement has encountered, it became clear that territorial peace goes beyond localized and targeted actions. It requires a redefinition of territory, a redefinition of nature based on its social, economic, political, cultural, and ecological configurations through commitments to social and community participation. So in this regard, the peace agreement approached territorial peace as the improvement of living conditions in rural areas while also addressing the political, economic, and ecological challenges faced by the diverse peoples and territories that inspired the accord. So three core elements of territorial peace can be highlighted. First, dismantling the land accumulation structures that date back to colonial times. Colombia has a highly unequal land distribution. It is estimated that 14% of the landowners owns around 81% of the land, with a Gini coefficient of 0.88. Colombia is ranked 11th globally among nations with the worst land distribution. And the situation, of course, has a strong relationship with the long-lasting war. Peasant communities have been historically displaced from their lands through violence, which has in turn triggered further violence. And struggles over land is among the primary drivers of Colombia's armed conflict. Second, destabilizing the dominant conception of socioeconomic development and rethinking it from the bottom up, allowing communities to make decisions about their own territories. Colombia has a long history of centralization. The capital city, Bogotá, still concentrates major political, economic, and administrative power, restricting regional autonomy. And this centralization has created disparities in access to public service and infrastructure, of course, exacerbating inequalities between central and peripheral regions. And finally, understanding territories through a socio-ecological lens. The notion of territorial peace takes an important but insufficient step in thinking territories not just as the socio-political sites in which political conflicts take place, but also as socio-ecological configurations that shapes community identities and history. Indigenous, Afro-Colombian, and peasant communities played a key role in articulating this perspective. We are a pluriethnic and multicultural country, so it was very important that those communities participated in this national debate about territory and about nature. This debate made clear that both legal and illegal armed actors have disputed control over natural resources, often with devastating consequences for local communities. Various forms of extractivism, such as land concentration, agricultural frontier expansion, extensive cattle ranching, mining, and the violence surrounding the cultivation, commercialization, and forced eradication of illicit crops, have been central to the armed conflict, resulting in, as Professor Valencia mentioned, deforestation, contamination of water sources, and soil degradation. So this conversation allowed to acknowledge the connection between extractivism and armed conflict, which marked a critical shift in the initial expectations of the peace agreement. Because at the beginning of the peace dialogues, for some parts of the countries, the agreement had been envisioned as a pathway for new extractive projects, particularly oil exploration. So complex relationships between war and environment degradation mediated. It was, clear that it was not just, there was not a direct connection between war and environmental degradation, that this relationship was mediated by extractive economies. But ethnic communities have insisted that these forms of violence are not limited to environmental degradation, but also involve deep disruptions to the web of life that constitutes their territories and their identities. Understanding the challenges of territorial peace, as well as the violence against territory, requires engaging with the way ethnic communities interpret and understand their territories. And I mentioned at the beginning that it was insufficient. It was an important step, without a doubt, but it was insufficient because the emphasis of the agreement was still on land restitution and the productivity of land for peasant communities because of this history of land dispossession. So aligned with these ideas, the peace agreement established several key measures within the 5 points of the agreement. So one is land restitution. The government committed to distributing 3 million hectares, which is about 7.4 million acres, to landless or land scarce peasants and ethnic community members. PDETs, or territorially focused development programs, in order to approach the second key concept that I mentioned before. These are long-term development programs that are expected to be implemented in around 170 municipalities. That is around 50% of municipalities of the country across 16 regions, to transform rural areas most affected by conflict through community-driven and inclusive approaches. Building these programs that are articulated in 16 plans, one for each region, is probably one of the most important endeavors in participatory planning ever done in the country, and a big step to understand development from the bottom up. Yet, again, the feasibility to implement them is another issue. And finally, environmental zoning and substitution of illicit crops in national natural parks to, approach the second concept that I mentioned. The environmental zoning is a strategic framework that aims to guarantee sustainable development in the PDETs program, and seek to redefine the agricultural frontier to protect areas of special environmental interest. And regarding the last point, as you may know, the substitution of illicit crops is an essential part of the agreement, and some of these crops are in protected areas. So this refers to the process of recuperating those areas and find alternatives for sustainable and legal agricultural practices that promote environmental conservation and rural development. So the idea of, next please. Thank you. The idea of territorial peace involved an essential transformation in the way peace dialogues were carried out. It opened up a national discussion about the recognition of the political, cultural, and geographical diversity of the country, which not only allowed for a better understanding of the causes and consequences of the armed conflict, but also of its environmental effects. Although it delved little into the environmental aspect, it paved the way for the institutions created as a result of the agreement to develop this issue. Sorry. In practical terms, the implementation of the initiatives proposed in the agreement have experienced a lot of challenges. It is estimated that after 9 years of the peace agreement, only 16% of the land restitution has been achieved. Regarding the PEDEX program, there has been significant progress, but not enough to meet the full implementation by 2032. And this progress is mainly reflected in rural education and agricultural production, but very little in social land management and land use. And as for the environmental goals, like the last report said that only 11% of the environmental initiatives have been fully fulfilled, 58% had minimal progress, and 10% had not started their implementation yet. So still, it's still an important concept, and as I said, it paved the way for other institutions to keep unfolding of the idea on the idea of territorial peace. The last point of the agreement established the comprehensive system for truth, justice, reparation, and non-repetition, composed of the Truth Commission, the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, and the Unit for the Search of Disappeared Person. I will now focus on how these first two institutions continued with the legacy of the territorial peace perspective. The Truth Commission operated as an independent body between 2018 and 2022 to clarify the causes and consequences of Colombia's armed conflict. Through testimonies from more than 28,000 people, it documented human rights violations and made recommendations for non-repetition, but also it documented crimes against nature. By listening to multiple voices from across the country, the Commission gained new insights into the environmental impacts of war. It concluded that nature itself was a victim of the armed conflict. According to the report, it was instrumentalized to commit serious violations of international humanitarian law and was exploited to financially sustain armed actors. In 2011, a decree that modified the victims' law to address indigenous peoples' needs had already introduced this idea of territories as victims of war, but the Commission gave content and visibility to this idea through public engagement. Next. And among the forms of violence against nature that this commission documented, they said oil spills, aerial spraying with glyphosate, illegal crops, aerial bombing, deforestation, use of ecosystems for forced disappearances, use of animals for military purposes, assassination of environmental defenders. You probably know that Colombia is the deadliest country for environmental activists in the world. Next. As Ruiz Serna has noted, understanding the territorial impacts of war goes beyond environmental terminology. It requires an ontological conversation about what nature is for different communities. Thus, the Commission not only documented environmental harm, but also asked deeper questions, such as next, or is it this like, can you go next? Yes. And then we'll go back. Sorry, I think I changed the order. So how are territories socially produced? How do we relate to other beings in nature? And what ecological, social, political, and spiritual relationships form territories? And how are these destroyed by war? Through this lens, the Commission granted nature a status it previously lacked and explored the complex layers of harm that the socio-ecological fabric endured. To illustrate this, and please, if you can go back. Thank you. I'd like to quote from the Commission's final report. If its language were that of words, what would nature say about its fate during the internal armed conflict in Colombia? Perhaps it would speak of the terrible devices that exploded on its soil, the deafening sound of detonations, the misfortune of trees whose vital sap flow was interrupted, the burning of their leaves and trunks, the pain endured by thousands of animals. It might also mention how silence took over the ravaged spaces or lament the countless munitions still embedded in its fragile ecosystems, some inert, others latent, lurking. Next. So 2 slides. Thank you. This intercultural approach of the Commission let us think beyond environmental damage and understand that war transforms environmental dynamics, changing traditional livelihood patterns with deleterious consequences for people's lives and the environment. Fractures the socio-ecological fabric that constitutes rural communities' identities and endangers the harmony of territories, provoking spiritual imbalances. The Commission's work laid the groundwork for the special jurisdiction for peace to adopt a biocentric approach to transitional justice. Next. Next. This jurisdiction is the justice component of the comprehensive system for truth, justice, reparation, and non-repetition, as I mentioned before, and it is responsible for administering transitional justice and addressing crimes committed during the armed conflict. And it is expected to work during 20 years. So it still has like around 10 years. I bring up the HIP, the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, because its work shows how the notion of territorial peace has unfolded in the justice component in the aftermath of the agreement. In addition to the crimes against humanity, the HIP is analyzing cases related to the destruction of ecosystems, deforestation, contamination of water resources, and other environmental damages that occurred during the armed conflict. And it is looking for ways to repair the damage as part of the comprehensive reparation for victims, human and non-human. This approach represents progress in recognizing nature not only as an object of protection, but also as a subject that requires justice within the peace process. This is aligned with some legal systems. This is not new from Colombia. It's aligned with other initiatives that, in the context of today's ecological crisis, are beginning to recognize the rights of nature at constitutional, legal, and jurisprudential levels, granting ecosystems legal personhood. Moving beyond beyond an anthropocentric perspective toward a more biocentric perspective. But in Colombia, this shift is strongly influenced by the recognition of war's impact on the environment and a broader conception of territories and nature. Next. Before HIP, other legal actions had already recognized nature as a rights-bearing subject. For instance, in 2016, the Constitutional Court declared the Atrato River as a subject of rights, entitling it to protection, conservation, restoration, and maintenance for its own sake, not just for human benefit. And it also created a guardianship involving state and ethnic community representatives. And in 2018, the Supreme Court recognized the Colombian Amazon as a subject of rights, obligating the government to reduce deforestation. This ruling responded to a lawsuit led by children and youth, reflecting growing concern over increased deforestation after the peace agreement. And I think it's worth mentioning that when we were already talking about nature as a victim of war, that was kind of like a clear idea at the time. This decision exposes another layer of the complex relationship between war, peace, and environmental protection, because deforestation rates skyrocketed after the signature of the peace agreement, and when the armed conflict was at its lowest intensity, the year after the agreement was signed, deforestation in the Amazon region of Colombia increased by 44% compared to the previous year, and during the lockdown due to the pandemic in 2020, it increased by 82.8%. And this was also the deadliest year for environmental activists in the country. So following this lead, next, please. The HEP has moved forward a peace-building agenda in the justice system. And I would like to illustrate this through two short examples. First, the case 09, which investigates crimes against ethnic communities and their territories. As part of it, in 2024, the HEP officially recognized the ancestral, sacred, and collective territory of the Sierra Nevada in Santa Marta and the indigenous people of the Iku, Cagaba, Wiwa, and Cancuamo as victims. This decision acknowledged the severe and disproportionate violence suffered by these communities and their sacred sites. It highlights the profound impacts on not only their physical survival, but also their cultural and spiritual existence, particularly the role of indigenous women as spiritual and cultural leaders. And it also draws on national and international legal frameworks to protect the rights of indigenous peoples. The recognition of nature as victim and a subject of rights, and I think this is important, has not been limited to indigenous territories. The HEP also recognized the Cauca River as a victim of the armed conflict in case 05, which focuses on northern Cauca and southern Valle del Cauca. They have demonstrated that between 2000 and 2004, paramilitary groups used the river as a mass grave and dumped toxic chemicals linked to illegal mining and drug production, severely harming the ecosystem and the communities that depend on it. Different communities, Afro-Colombian, peasant, and indigenous communities. So to conclude, it's still the legal consequences of the decision are unclear. Little progress has been made in the implementation of reparation programs, although the HEP is already proposing some programs in which ex-combatants have to do reparation acts for the communities and the environments that they harmed. And I think that despite those challenges, it's still very, very important because it moves forward an ecological and plural peace-building agenda.
Finally, we want to remark that nature has been a direct victim of the armed conflict, being used, as we said, as a tool of power and subjected to multiple forms of violence and destruction. But the armed conflict has not only been financed by extractive activities, but has exacerbated competition for control over nature which has generated more violence. As we saw, the communities in the regions most affected by the conflict are the same ones facing the greatest impacts of environmental degradation. Therefore, environmental justice is presented as a fundamental axis for peace building, as it implies an equitable distribution of access to natural resources, as well as the recognition of the territorial and biocultural rights of local communities. So in this context, we need to guarantee and strengthen the processes of territorial defense, understanding that the territorial defense implies the defense of community, but also certain spaces and ways of life. I think this this notion is very different from the military notion of control, of territorial control. So this idea of territorial defense rescues the values of collective care, of cooperation with human and non-human life, where principles such as inclusion and sustainability are fundamental. So we finally want to say that peace means that both human and nature need to be protected, repaired, and restored. And with this, we end our presentation.
Thank you very much, Professor Valencia and Professor Giraldo, really for walking us through the conflict in Colombia, and also how nature has also become a victim of this really prolonged conflict. And it's quite encouraging to see some of the efforts to recognize nature as a victim of war, and maybe also for us to think how to overcome the challenges in implementing this effort. So thank you very much for your informative and really insightful presentation. Now let's move on to the Q&A or open forum. I know we have perhaps 10 minutes left, but maybe we can extend for a few minutes if our guest speakers are fine with that, but we'll try to keep in time. First, we have a question, and right, thank you everyone again. If you have your questions, please feel free to type in the chat box or the Q&A box. We have this question by Raymond Andaya. And he says, thank you, Professor Giraldo and Professor Valencia. Your work reminded me of the socio-spatial perspective to human rights research. To me, the idea of nature being a victim of the armed conflict also makes it a social agent in the politics of peace building and transitional justice. Thus, I think of the potential representativeness of the nature victim. My question then is, how well represented is the environment or nature in Colombian transitional justice, whether through civil society activists, local communities, and institutional actors, ensuring that nature continues to be part of the peace-building conversation? Great question, Raymond. Thank you.
Well, I could thank you so much for your question, and yeah, your very thoughtful comment. I would say that HIP is making big efforts to listen to civil society and listening to different kind of activists, environmental activists, but also representatives of indigenous, Afro-Colombian, peasant communities. But there's also another thing that it is important to, endure this representation, and it is the constitution of this jurisdiction itself. There are Afro-Colombian and indigenous judges and magistrates. So I think that's important to ensure that it's not only, like a state institution from a hierarchical position listening to the civil society, but also, transforming this justice institutions that are usually very conservative, and creating a diverse a group of people that are making decisions about transitional justice.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. I'm also very much struck by this. You emphasized earlier the ontological shift of how we approach nature, because, the concepts of territory, even the concept of transitional justice and all of this, the institutions attached to this are very much, human-made, right? So I think that ontological shift is really necessary to recognize nature, not just a victim, as you've said also, but also that agency to be able to have that representation in this otherwise human-dominated institutions. How to go about that might be challenging, but of course, how we conceive of territories, as Professor Valencia mentioned earlier as well, are very much military-centric, anthropocentric, and all this. So I think really the challenge is, despite having this anthropocentric institutions and social organizations, how can we have more equal approaches to nature? I've been toying with this idea in my own research interest. So I think what some of the examples that you mentioned that's included in the agreement, how to go about this transitional justice, I think these are good and very concrete demonstrations of how we can include non-human nature in transitional justice. Right. Thank you.
Yeah, just to share an anecdote, I remember some people talking about some of the sessions in the jurisdiction in HEP that start with harmonization and asking permission for from the ancestors, and like balancing spiritual energies, and this can be like even uncomfortable for some people, but I think it is also like the role of indigenous judges to say, like we need to have that like ontological conversation, as you said. We need to understand that we perceive territories and nature from like a non-Western perspective, and if we're gonna repair the harms of war that are also colonial harms, we need to be open to like those conversations, and like even non-human conversations.
Yeah, I completely agree. Yeah, please, Professor.
I want to just to say that there's a big difference between restoration and reparation when we are thinking about nature, because normally we have this discussion about the restoration of the territories, despite all the social complexity relations that are in the territories, when you are saying that it is very important also to repair in a transitional way.
Yeah, I completely agree. And also, I think this ontology has been there for so long, as you've mentioned. Like, if we include indigenous communities, it's been there for so long. Actually, this separation of human from non-human nature is a modern outcome and a colonial legacy. Thank you so much. We have another question by Mohan Casey of Hiroshima University. And his question is, as you mentioned that Colombia is recognized as one of the deadliest countries for environmental activists. Actually, Philippines is also one of those countries with high number of assassinations against environmental defenders. What specific initiatives or policies has the Colombian government implemented to address this crisis and enhance protections for the environmental defenders? Thank you, Mohan, for that question.
So, thinking about the peace accord established in 2016, there is a formal institution that is called like the Security Assurance Commission that was created to protect the social leaders and environmental leaders, but its function is very regular. So many of the social leaders, for example, argue that it's important also to fortify their own protective processes. I don't know if it was clear. There are some institutional approaches, but they are not functioning so well.
Thank you, Professor Valencia. And thanks again, Mohan, for that question. We have a third question. Perhaps this would be the last question. I know this is really an exciting topic, but due to the time, so this is the last question. By Thomas Clougher, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, and apologies if not. And he says, thank you. Does this work and some of the peace talks consider the indigenous communities who use coca leaf currently, seeing that the plant itself has origins in Colombia? Or is eradication seemingly the only option with regard to the coca plant?
Indigenous communities have special protection to cultivate coca plants. They have like a legal protection, and this has been like it is still an ongoing conversation in Colombia. In the early 2000s, there was this government propaganda that talked about coca as the plant that kills, and it was coca la mata que mata, the plant that kills. And indigenous communities talk against that, and they were like, that's like a huge offense against our communities, against our ancestors and our culture. And I remember once that an indigenous leader told me, like, we've tolerated violence, displacement, but the offense against our sacred plants, it's just like the last act of colonial violence that we can take. And like from the legal perspective and the government perspective, like that's kind of solved in the way that they are allowed to cultivate the plant and use it for like all the traditional preparations. But it is like still a cultural fight in Colombia. There are still a lot of people who like have this idea that coca means drugs, and it seems that things have changed a little bit, but not as much as it should.
Okay, thank you. I think now we've reached the end of the webinar. Perhaps some closing remarks from our guest speakers. If there's anything you'd like to add. I'm actually quite interested also in whether this topic has been part of the conversation in COP last year, because the People's COP, right? So perhaps, the inclusion of indigenous community could have been part of that. There's so many other related topics we can talk about, but I look forward to having this, continuing this conversation, perhaps online. And it would be great to meet you both in person as well. And I thank all our attendees. Yes, Professor Giraldo.
No, I'm just saying, hopefully. I really look forward to meeting you and have an in-person conversation.
My final remark is that despite this very difficult context we are living, I think we need to keep believing in peace and in the protection of the people and the protection of nature, because we are facing difficult times and we need to think in, I don't know, I'm a mother. I have a little boy of 10, he has 10 years old. And I think a lot in his future. Mm-hmm. I think about the peace, the future, the nature, the sustainability. So I think it's very important to continue, despite all this war, the aggressive context, the authoritarianism we are facing.
Thank you, Professor Valencia. There's indeed a big task ahead of us, and I think this kind of conversation is one of those steps. And really thank you for sharing with us this much needed topic. And I'd like to thank our attendees as well for taking the time to join us today. Please join me in once again thanking Professor Valencia and Professor Giraldo. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the invitation, Dalia, and thanks a lot for all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.